So I just want to do a quick introduction of the three brilliant folks here to the right, and then I'll ask one question, they'll respond to it, and then we'll open it up to the floor. So going from my left to my right, we have Strela Cervas from the California Environmental Justice Alliance. That does an amazing work across the state in California, working deeply with communities to chart their vision towards a clean and healthy economy, community, and society. And Strela works both translocally and at a statewide level. Next to Strela is Vivian Huang. Vivian is the campaign and organizing director at Asian Pacific Environmental Network, a phenomenal group here in the Bay Area. And Vivian has worked alongside community groups and members to develop and collaborate on leadership around justice, both in environmental justice and energy work. And she and Andres are the huge Richmond organizers. So all the stuff happening in Richmond, the two of them right here. And then next to Vivian is Sweeney. And Sean is the director and founder of the International Program on Labor, Climate, and the Environment at the Murphy Institute at CUNY in New York City. He made it out just before the snow. And Sean also coordinates the very important, critical trade unions for energy democracy. And the three of them can, I think, speak very well to what Denise just laid out about building across alliances and making connections. So the question I actually have for you all is kind of on this. We are at have a monumental task in actually trying to finish what movements before have started and really transform the economy, our culture. That's really rooted in beliefs, in structure, and in financing. So given your work at the local, state, and even international level, what ways are you working to organize communities? And what are some of the kind of the strategies and models that you've been using that really can help build those deep connections that we need to actually have wholesale transformation? And I could say we can go local to international. So Vivian, you can start it off.
It's great to be here. So I'm with Asian Pacific Environmental Network. We are a 20-year-old organization that's been organizing in immigrant and refugee Asian American communities around environmental and social justice. And so when I talk about I'm a child of immigrants. My entire family in the U.S., is an immigrant community. I very much grew up in that experience, right? And so just hearing a lot of what Denise was talking about in terms of this global economy, I always start there, like to really recognize that for a lot of folks who are immigrants and refugees, they're coming because they've been displaced, or that they've been forced to migrate, or that they've faced imperialism and war abroad, and that's what actually is driving a lot of folks to the U.S. And so that's sort of the context I think that a lot of the groups that we work with are here in the U.S. under. So I like to remind people of kind of this arc of a story of our organizing in Richmond that I'll spend a little time today to really highlight, I think, the evolution over time that collectively we've come through to get to what we think energy democracy should be, right? And so when APEN first started out, one of our first campaigns was around a Chevron refinery explosion that happened back in, I think, 1999. I might have the year wrong, but and at that time, our Richmond community members, they advocated for a multilingual warning system. Right, so there was a warning system in place, but it wasn't at all translated or interpreted in different languages. So many of the community members, the Laotian community members at the time in that community, had no idea about any of the dangers of the explosion and kind of the health impacts that all that toxic pollution would have outside. And I think that from that campaign, right, realize, well, we don't just want to be warned when something bad happens, right? We want to actually prevent those bad things from happening in the first place, right? And so kind of our subsequent campaign was really focused on how can we really look at preventing expansions of these refinery processes, right? And how do we actually think about making the refinery safer, right, and less polluting. And then I think over time, more evolution and we don't that's not exactly what we want either, right? We actually want to be looking at alternative sources of energy, right? Like, and not just focused on extractive fossil fuel energy. And so then we move to, okay, let's really look at how do we build up more renewable energy, right? How do we get more energy that's actually coming from renewable sources so that we're not even relying on this really toxic, polluting refinery as a way to get us energy. And then I think that as we thought about it more, well, it's not like we just want Chevron to start, generating renewable energy with solar farms, right? I mean, that's not exactly what we want either, right? And so I think through this process, it's like we've really landed on like what we're actually really fighting for. Is this just transition in the economy that Denise talked about? Is this real shift, right, around not just the types of energy that we're getting, but really sort of who owns and controls and benefits, from this energy? And so when I think about energy democracy, some of the questions that I know that we've been grappling with is thinking about, what purpose is our energy for? Right? Is it just to drive our current way of life, or is our current way of life actually not sustainable, and we actually want to produce energy for different things that collectively are needed by everyone, right? Who is generating the energy? Who owns the energy, and then who benefits from the energy, right? These are actually all very important questions that really get at, I think, the thinking around we need to change our economy. We need to really change the way like we think about means of production and like how wealth is created and how it's actually collectively owned, right, by everyone involved. And so I think in that evolution of our thinking is that there's also been, I think, as part of that process, a greater and greater emphasis on really thinking about how are we developing and growing ourselves in that process as well. Right? And so that we are transitioning from just being kind of like passive like people in society being kind of told what to do, but really like active leaders and engaged in really driving and determining, right, where our communities go and what our communities should look like. And so one of the strategies that I wanted to really lift up is that I've been really proud of what we've done at APEN is that we've really shifted a lot of our leadership development model in the work. So when we talk about organizing community members, it's not just to like turn out people to a campaign event or to like mobilize people for specific action, but it's like how are we actually all developing ourselves to grow as leaders so that we can actually be the ones driving the decisions, driving the conversation, setting the agenda, right? And I think that's a really important part when we talk about energy democracy is that we actually need to be the ones ourselves generating the different ways that we want to build this new economy. The other strategy that I think is also really important is around changing the story. So I think that what Denise really highlighted for me is that, when you had the slave economy, like everything was oriented around that and everything was made to kind of legitimize that, right? And I think it's very similar with our current fossil fuel economy. And so I think a big piece of what we're trying to do is that culture shift, right? So it's that shift within ourselves about how we think about and relate to the economy, but also doing those shifts out in the community and then in our systems, right? And so a lot of the shifts that are happening are really around relationships, how we're relating to each other and how we really relate to energy and the economy as a whole. So I think that for me, just having this personal experience of growing up in an immigrant community and seeing kind of all of the destruction and the exploitation that has happened, in my community, this sort of organizing movement represents an opportunity for all of us to actually to be able to take power, right? To take power, to generate power, to really like change the way we power our society and our economy. And so I think that because we're really looking at how we change all our relationships, it's just really, I think, been important for us to think about the culture shifts and the leadership development pieces that I think sometimes don't get talked about when we're talking about policy or we're talking about a campaign or we're talking about like electoral strategy, right? But I think they're actually really fundamental pieces if we're talking about really changing the way we orient and think about our society and how we build a better model.
So I'm going to just talk about the California Environmental Justice Alliance, give you a little bit of background, tell you a little bit about my own story, and then kind of relate it to the California work that we do. So the California Environmental Justice Alliance is a statewide alliance of 6 kick-ass environmental justice organizations. So we have APEN, Poder, CBE as well. We also work with the Center on Race, Poverty, and the Environment in the San Joaquin Valley, the Environmental Health Coalition in San Diego, the Center for Community Action and Environmental Justice in Riverside. I just want to give shout out to all the organizations that contribute so much time to our collective work at CEJA. And what we really do is we bring together all of these great organizations and develop what they want in terms of community vision for their own local communities, and bring that voice to the statewide level to affect statewide policy. So we're really one of the only environmental justice coalitions, organizations that's doing this type of work in Sacramento. And in fact, I was just in Sacramento yesterday. Just backtracking a little bit, so how I got into this work. So my parents immigrated as well. I come from an immigrant family. And I was born and raised in Los Angeles, and I'm still there until today. After college, I wanted to go back to the Philippines to discover my motherland, and learn about the struggle going on there. And it just blew my mind as to what I witnessed in the Philippines in terms of the mining and the extractive mining that was going on, and the environmental impacts and I visited a Dole plantation, Dole banana plantation, where they were spraying the workers overhead with toxic chemicals as they were working, and they literally had no masks or anything to cover their faces, and so they were inhaling all this stuff. And so I came back. I just came back so committed to changing the system, because it was really about the multinational corporations and the economy and the profit-driven economy that was and the system that was driving what was going on in the Philippines, and then I could relate it back to what was happening here in the United States and California. Growing up, I had asthma growing up, and so did my siblings as well. And so when I just got involved in the social justice world here, it just made sense as to how corporations and how big oil companies and the gas industry really exploits our people, and especially low-income and communities of color, to the extent that we're dying from their operations. And so that's how I got involved in CEJA, in the California Environmental Justice Alliance. And I feel that really the power really needs to come from the people. And so when I started at CEJA in 2008, we really didn't have an energy program at all. At the time, in terms of California politics, the legislature was sort of changing the makeup of it. So enviros, we all know the environmental legislatures are kind of older white folks. Now that has kind of over time has shifted, and so now we're primarily a lot of electeds of color. And back then, energy was something back then, and is something now that still is controlled by the utilities. It's controlled by big oil. It's controlled by big gas interests that really put people down at the bottom. Like they don't protect their interests at all. It's really about their bottom line. And so we got involved in energy because the people that we work with that are experiencing environmental racism live right next to the chevrons of their communities, the oil refineries, or the big dirty natural gas power plants, and then the big freeways. There's a lot of kind of the cumulative impact of all these things. Just some statistics. So I work out of the Communities for a Better Environment office in LA in Huntington Park, not Huntington Beach, but Huntington Park, which is a completely different area. It's one of the most polluted areas in the nation. And back when I got started, they were fighting the Vernon Power Plant, which is a natural gas power plant facility. And the Vernon Power Plant said, it'll be fine if we build this. If we build it, it will only result in 11 deaths per year. 11 deaths per year, as you know, and so this was kind of their justification for building it. And so we see these natural gas power plants kind of popping up all over the place. So talking about bringing it back to the meta narrative or the narrative, the dominant narrative in California is, you know, we need these natural gas is good. It is a renewable form of energy. It's going to bring jobs into local communities. It's going to improve the health of local communities. But that's not the local experience. That's not, you know, that's just not the reality, and that's just not the truth. Same thing in San Diego. There's a Pio Pico power plant that was being built primarily, again, in a low-income community of color area. That would have cost the customers there $1.6 billion annually, even if they didn't get the energy that was coming from the Pio Pico power plant. So they would still need to pay for this dirty fossil fuel power plant, even if they weren't getting the energy for over 25 years too. And then emitting all of the carbon dioxide and the toxic stuff that was coming out of it. So this is the kind of the lived reality. And so we got into energy because we needed an alternative. We needed a better solution to all of this. And the work that I do, so I'm the lead on our energy and climate work. Some of the examples that we've done to really shift the narrative and shift in terms of the form of like who's in power here is we sponsor legislation, we impact legislation. We're also at the intervene at the California Public Utilities Commission. And so we do a lot of policy from the grassroots level. So we ask our, local community organizations and community members, what's your vision for how you want the transformation of your community to look like and the energy to look like? Do you want to own it? Do you continually want to be kind of at the mercy of the big utilities? And the answer is, we all know what the answer is. We all want locally controlled kind of energy. I'll just give a couple of examples of sort of the strategies and the organizing that we do. So a couple of years ago, for example, we sponsored our first legislation. It was called Solar for All. A lot of people were involved in that, and we're still, engaged in that sort of legislative effort. So Solar for All would have brought was going to be a pilot program. It was a legislative effort to bring in local renewable energy into low-income communities. So it was very explicit about that. And we trained up some women leaders. We also partnered with the Women's Policy Institute and trained our women leaders on how to run a legislative campaign. And then we trained the community members about energy, because a lot of our community members, a lot of us, we just kind of pay for our bills, our electricity bills, and never look at what we're paying for. And we're paying for a lot of, transmission lines and things like that, end up going to the pockets of these big utility companies, and we have no idea. And we, along with our great community organizations, developed some great hands-on training modules using Legos and shoeboxes and string. And so it was very hands-on and looked at what your energy structure looks like now, and then what's your vision for it, right? And then we trained up, and so it was mostly, primarily women of color, communities of color that were going toe-to-toe with the utilities in this campaign. And that's kind of been, the organizing effort that we've been using, is really trying to get the communities up to the statewide level and to confront the utilities and to educate our legislators and our elected officials about what's happening on the ground. And then the couple of other things that we do is we also do these things called energy stakeholder convenings. So it's not just about the environmental justice organizations and getting them together, but we really need to be in dialogue, as Denise was saying, with our enviro partners and clean tech and labor, because we really need to be working together. And then lastly, one movement building activity that we do every year is we have an annual, what's called a Congreso. So we bring up community leaders, about 150 to 200, like this year we're targeting 250 community leaders up to Sacramento to tell their demand from the elected officials, what they want in terms of justice and policy on the ground. So those are just a few tactics and strategies that we use. Thank you.
My personal story can be summed up in one sentence. My father was a coal miner in northeast England. He was a World War II veteran, and he died when I was 17 years old. Combination of the two. And I'm always, taken aback when members of the United Mine Workers accuse me of a middle-class academic background. It's like, ask me, let's sit down and talk about it in more detail. My community, though, is not a physical community. It's a political community, the trade union movement. I work at the global level with unions, so and that also informs strategy as well for reasons we can go into. We also have a labor workshop later, so if anybody wants to discuss this more, I recommend coming to that and give that a little general plug. Strategically, energy democracy, as far as labor is concerned, we have to take the fight inside the labor movement first and foremost. That's one side of the strategy. The other side of the strategy is to be alert and aware to what's going on outside and to listen to other movements. This is something that a lot of union people don't find easy to do. They often think that they are the bee's knees, the big cheese, and they don't have to listen to anybody else. That's changed somewhat, but it's still very much part of the culture. Now, taking the struggle inside labor, I use the phrase, we have to turn labor into a carbon battleground. It's not a perfect phrase. But the one issue which I think will change the labor movement forever is the Keystone XL pipeline. Because here it was put forward that here you have unions that were part of the Blue-Green Alliance, had talked the talk a little bit about climate change during the early days of Obama, were then put in front of them was a project labor agreement with TransCanada Corporation to build a pipeline. And it was obviously not just about one pipeline. It was a strategic alliance between the building trades, or the leadership of the building trades, and the American Petroleum Institute and fossil fuel interests writ large. And this is basically a policy failure of the Obama administration because they didn't deliver on the green jobs promises. There was a heavy recession. The members, union members in blue-collar trades pushed back against the green economy, and union leaders had nothing to offer. So when along comes the industry and says, here's some jobs, never mind all these green jobs, blah, blah, blah. Here's real jobs for your members, and, you better sign on. They signed on. So the question then comes, how do you handle that? Because all over the media, right until this day, it's all about jobs, and Obama's losing blue-collar America because he's not committed to jobs and he's with the environmental extremists. So what we did was this. First of all, we got unions together, and we said there were a couple of things we needed to do. One was expose the lies about jobs. That was the first thing. So there was a study, some of you may have heard of it, which I co-authored with a couple of colleagues, Pipe Dreams, Jobs Gained, Jobs Lost in the Construction of Keystone XL. Then the key was to get unions to oppose the pipeline. This was where it got really difficult. The culture in labor is if a union's got some skin in the game, for the most part, it's best to avoid getting into that. So a nurses union or a teachers union or a transport union that is going to make a statement about a pipeline that's going to affect other union members is taking on. They're playing with fire. So when the transport unions, two of them, came out, and it was after weeks of serious, persuasive conversations, including writing out statements for them that sort of articulated a vision of not just energy democracy, but real job creation. When they opposed Keystone XL back in August 2011, all hell let loose inside the labor movement. Letters and memoranda were flying around. If you oppose this pipeline, we're going to oppose public transport refunding on the Hill. This was unions talking to each other. In other words, getting into a war. The nurses then came out against Keystone XL. United Electrical Workers came out against Keystone XL. New York State Nurses Association. So now we have 6 unions who are opposed. But it's opened up and helped change the culture within labor. Because what we have to say in terms of narrative is the following. That all unions are energy unions, not just the ones who run or build pipelines, who are working coal-fired power stations or refineries. We all have a stake in the energy future. The future of the planet is in jeopardy, and therefore we're all energy unions. Secondly, we have to extend the notion of solidarity, not just to frontline communities, not just to indigenous communities who are fighting the fossil fuel companies, but also to future generations, to workers and farmers and ordinary people in other countries, and also to the ecosystem itself. We need to have solidarity with the planet. And that's something that trade unionists listen to, and they understand solidarity. So we work with the vocabulary of solidarity. The issue, though, is once we've moved some unions towards embracing the idea of climate justice, that we need radical action, then the question is, well, what is going to be done? We were confronted with this very, very clearly in the People's Climate March. A lot of union leaders said, yes, we need to be out there on the march with everybody else fighting for climate justice. But when their members asked them, so what are we going to do about climate change? They often went very quiet. They didn't really know what to say. So the idea then is that one of the key areas is energy. If we can't tackle the emissions, energy-related emissions, and if we include transport-related emissions on top of that, then we won't address the problem. So the key then is, how do we do that? And this takes us to the international level, because on the global stage, a lot of unions went along with the green economy framing. It's the good capitalists against the bad capitalists. The ones who want to commodify nature as opposed to the ones who want to destroy nature. So there was a balance, right, going on. There's a fight going on between a sort of more liberal kind of view of a green economy and the business as usual, like drill to the last drop or whatever, or pull out the last piece of coal. And a lot of unions in Europe felt that that was the best, particularly, they led the debate. That was the best available option, was to go along with the green capitalist model and hope that in so doing, unions would have a seat at the table and workers would be respected. Thus the demands in the talks, at the climate change talks, for a just transition for workers. And this is where the narrative question comes out. And I thought Denise really nailed it about learning from past movements. There's a narrative in the history of the trade union movement on economic democracy that we can reach into and say ownership and control of the means of production. And nothing is more important really than the production of energy right now. We need to fight for control. That resonates with a lot of unions around the world even today. But the new narrative is, it's not just public versus private, it's not just old style nationalization. We have to have real democracy, real transparency, real accountability, but we also have to do things to scale. And so what I appeal to people who do fantastic work on the local level, that look at what the International Energy Agency is saying needs to be done to stay within 2 degrees. And we all in this room know that 2 degrees is already not good enough. But if it's 2 degrees, we have to decarbonize the global economy to the level of 7% a year, every year from now until 2050. And we have to completely revolutionize the energy system in particular, but also food, agriculture, transport, retail, you name it. And the International Energy Agency, not a radical organization, said that the only way this can happen is revolutionary changes in global political economy and the methods of production and consumption. So I refer back to the sister who said this morning, who read out the platform of the Democratic Party in 1900. It may sound, in the context of 1900, it was pretty clear what needs to be done. And in the context of 2015, it's pretty clear that if we're going to build a movement for energy democracy, it has to be part of a broader social movement for social transformation. If we keep our eye on that prize, I'm sure we'll be successful. But thanks again for having me here.
Hi, I'm Ken White from Post Carbon Institute. And two of the speakers used a really powerful phrase in American politics, which is our way of life. And we know that our way of life has increasingly been working for far fewer people, and that many people have been left out of our way of life for a long time. So I'm just wondering if you have comments on squaring that reality with the very real needs of communities around economic justice, and also the reality that we probably won't be able to rely on a growing economy and growing energy supplies.
I mean, I think that one of the things that I think multiple people have talked about is that when we're talking about something so big, right, about fundamentally changing the entire way that we operate in terms of our economic system, that one thing that's been really important is thinking about how do we build even on a small scale, right, before we can get to that large scale, but even on like sort of a individual or like a community scale, like different models that really allow people to see a different way of being, right? And so the example I'm going to use is that one of the things that we've been really thinking about is so around energy, right? How can we actually generate energy and have it be owned and controlled in a really fundamentally different way than what is happening now, right? And so there's already some models out there of other communities who have done it. It's something that we're working on. I don't have anything concrete to show people, but I think it is an example where I think our members are really excited about how can we actually, have solar on a rooftop that we actually own, that we actually govern, that we actually think about what are the benefits, that are being generated for our community from that, right? And in that process, I think people are really going to be fundamentally changing, right? Because there's just a whole level of different orientation and different, I think, knowledge that's required to do that. And so, so our members are really thinking about, okay, so even in like a cooperative structure, right? It's like, many of us have never worked in a cooperative. I've never worked in a cooperative. I feel like I'm learning all of this and really shifting myself internally too, how I think about how we can actually run an economy, right, that actually looks really fundamentally different. And so I think in my head, like in the way that we've been talking about, is how can we start with the small steps that really get us that experience and that practice of really orienting and building relationships with each other really differently. And then the hope is that I think over time, as we continue building upon those models and building more models, and then through that experience, like refining it, that we are going to end up, I think, in a very fundamentally different place, right? And so that's sort of just some of the thinking that I think we've had about how to try to make some of these concepts really tangible. And so that people can really see what does that different way of life look like.
Our way of life is really almost bankrupt, right? There's no joy. So how do we begin to, and people feel it, the quality of life is now more important to them than working 40 hours a week and not seeing their kids and being on the freeway and traffic. And so there are places around the world, like Bhutan, for example, is actually throwing out the GDP, gross domestic product, as a way to measure well-being and developing a happiness index. And it has everything to do with your access to nature and your opportunity to spend time with kids. And so how do we change the frame? How do we not work within the frame? Because we'll always be on the periphery of that current dominant frame unless we change the frame completely about what our way of life needs to be and what is well-being and how do we measure it.